Welcome back. In this video, we'll be discussing the rhetorical triangle and also providing a more comprehensive definition of what rhetoric is as we try to unpack the purpose and the structure and components of the rhetorical analysis essay. So again, we established that a rhetorical analysis essay, I'm going to abbreviate quickly, is designed to figure out what the how of a text is. And so a quick example of this would be a speech. Let's say that a political candidate is putting together a speech. We would be interested in knowing how he structures the speech, how he addresses the audience, what his tone is, what type of figurative language he uses. Does he try to be relatable? And if so, how does he create that connection to the audience? What type of appeals does he use? Does he refer to facts and data, or does he rely more on emotional appeals, and so on and so forth? So these are all questions that a rhetorical analysis would strive to answer. And the purpose behind answering these questions is to determine how the audience is affected by the rhetorical strategies of the speaker. So that's really the goal of the rhetorical analysis. It's trying to, in a way, understand the psychology behind how humans are persuaded by various persuasive strategies, and therefore we can understand what persuasive strategies are most effective when communicating, and we can also see ways that communication can be used to manipulate, right, or in some cases even mislead or misguide people because they are unaware that they're being tricked or being manipulated by certain strategies. Now, to understand this, we have to understand what rhetoric is. And so in the previous video, we did provide a short definition of rhetoric, which I'm going to expand on here. So rhetoric refers to essentially persuasion. And this is persuasion in all forms. Specifically, we have the two broad forms of writing and speaking. But for example, if we're looking at a commercial, that's a case of a visual text, right, that also has an auditory component that is also being used to persuade the audience to purchase a product. So rhetoric is not always used only to persuade audiences to adopt certain beliefs or thoughts. They can also be used to promote certain behaviors, certain types of action. They can also be used to promote the benefits of a certain product over others, and so on and so forth. But essentially, rhetoric is this persuasive strategy that one uses. Now, we all use rhetoric, right? Rhetoric is around us all the time. It's also something that we all employ on a daily basis. And it can be as innocuous as greeting someone. If you happen to use a certain hand gesture when you greet somebody, or a certain handshake, that is a rhetorical strategy to move or sway the other person, in this case, your audience, to return the gesture, right? Or to return the greeting. So that is a form of rhetoric. Going to the mall, for example, and seeing an advertisement on a storefront, that's another form of rhetoric, right? You are being communicated to by the advertisement, and the advertisement is trying to persuade you to buy this product, or to be distracted enough to go into the store. And then there are other rhetorical advertisements within the store, et cetera, right? So rhetoric is always occurring very, very subtly, and sometimes in ways that we're not noticing, but it is there. And so it's important to understand that, right? We are agents of rhetoric, but that rhetoric is also being acted upon us. Now, to understand rhetoric a little better, in ELA, we use a graphic organizer, right, or a model called the rhetorical triangle. And the rhetorical triangle is essentially a representation of what we know as the rhetorical situation. So let me draw it for you here. We have a standard triangle, and And the triangle basically represents an instance of communication. And so there are three major points to the rhetorical triangle. The first is the speaker or writer. So there is always obviously someone who is originating some form of communication. Let's say, for example, that a teacher is speaking to a classroom full of students. The teacher is the speaker or writer. He or she is trying to persuade, quote unquote, the students to learn the content of the lesson. And so he or she is the one originating the message. Now, the students are known as the audience, right? So there's always an audience receiving the message. The audience does not necessarily comprehend or internalize the message, but they are receiving it nonetheless, right? So messages can either be successful or unsuccessful. And the speaker or writer originates that message and conveys it to the audience in some form. And we also have the subject of the message. So this would be the actual raw content that the teacher is trying to communicate to the audience. So if I'm in a classroom and I'm teaching a rhetorical strategy, then I would be trying to teach the audience, in this case, the students, the rhetorical strategy. The subject would be the rhetorical strategy, but how I communicate to the audience will change. So for example, if I am communicating to a teenage audience, I'm more likely to use certain pop culture references that they understand. So for instance, let's say students like certain memes. If I'm aware of the memes, then I will use them. I will make reference to them, or I will actually integrate them into the lesson so that the students will become more engaged and therefore more liable to learn. If I am trying to teach younger children, then I would need to find an equivalent, let's say, cultural or artistic reference that they appreciate. And then I would use that, I would leverage that, let's say, to gain more cachet with them and convince them that what I'm trying to communicate is important, that they should listen and that they should really internalize it. How I communicate is something we call the medium, right? So this is sort of our secret fourth part of the rhetorical triangle. So in the case of a teacher, he or she would be communicating usually verbally to his or her audience, right? So we could say that the medium or the mode of delivery of the message would be verbal. And we could say that it's essentially a speech, right? As opposed to, for example, an essay, or as opposed to a movie, or as opposed to music, or as opposed to a letter, etc., right? So the speaker or writer communicates to the audience through a certain medium. The medium informs some of the rhetorical strategies used by the speaker or writer. In future videos, we'll go into more detail about those different types of strategies. And there's always also, of course, the subject being the actual content of the message that is being communicated. So let's run through some brief examples to better understand why this rhetorical triangle works and how it can help us understand the purpose of rhetorical analysis. So let's say that we have the speaker here, and we'll have a basic audience. So we'll have a speaker, let's say, as a political candidate, perhaps a presidential candidate, speaking to his or her audience, and these would be, let's say, the general public. And we could say that the subject is a policy that the political candidate wants to promote and wants to convince the public is good for them. So in this case, the political candidate has different modes of expression. The medium maybe is a commercial. It could also be a speech, or it could even be some kind of op-ed or editorial, right? In all of these cases, the political candidate will be trying to convince the public of the benefits of the legitimacy of the policy. And so he or she will use different rhetorical strategies to do that. Perhaps he or she will point to weaknesses on the part of previous candidates or previous politicians whose policies were different and were perceived as being negative relative to the public, maybe the candidate will take a more affirmative stance and refer to the policy as being very beneficial, right? And they will outline different benefits that the public can expect to receive as a result of the policy. So there are different strategies that one might use. What is important here is that the public, right, their values, what they appreciate, what they find interesting and useful and necessary and important is going to inform how the speaker, in this case, the candidate, reaches out to them, right? So audience is really critical in the rhetorical triangle because audience helps us understand how the writer speaker is going to approach the communication. So some rhetorical strategies will be more effective with certain audiences and other rhetorical strategies will be less effective. So a savvy communicator is always trying to understand what his or her audience appreciates and wants, and therefore tailors his or her message to fit those expectations. Let's look at a different example. A slightly more controversial one, but one that I think will very clearly illuminate the importance of audience. So let's say there is a death in the family. We'll say that the speaker or writer is a parent. And we'll say that the audience is a son or daughter, but we're going to say teenage. And again, our subject is death in the family, right? So the teenage son or daughter is being told by the parent that a relative has passed away. Obviously, who the relative is also going to inform how the parent approaches the situation. If the son or daughter had a very close relationship with this relative, then the parent will probably be more sensitive, will probably find a way to break the news in a softer manner. But in any case, the point is that a teenager typically understands the concept of death. The teenager knows the ramifications of what that means. And so the parent can be usually more honest and more transparent about what's happened. And then the process becomes more about finding a way to guide the teenager through the process of grieving. If we change the audience, so now we no longer have a teenage son or daughter, but let's say we have a toddler son or daughter. This is going to radically change the mode of communication. So although the rhetorical situation remains mostly the same, we have the same speaker or writer, we have the same subject, we've changed the age of the audience, but changing the age of the audience also changes what that audience is capable of understanding and how he or she best receives information. So now a parent is going to approach the toddler in a manner very different than how he or she would approach the teenager. The toddler is probably not going to have a sophisticated understanding of death, if one at all. And so the parent must be very, very careful and delicate in the conveyance of this message. The parent will probably use a lot of euphemisms, will probably use a lot of analogies, may not even be fully honest with what death means. So the parent might say something along the lines of the relative is going away for a long time, the child probably won't see him or her again, et cetera, et cetera. The tone will probably be softer too, as to spare the feelings of the toddler, right? To make it easy for them to understand. And then later on, the parent will likely register that there will have to be another discussion as the child gets older about the same topic. So as you can see, the audience really, really affects significantly the conveyance and the construction of a message, right? So this audience here is arguably the most important part of the rhetorical triangle, because how the audience changes, what the audience values is going to directly affect the speaker and writer and his or her attempt to convey the message. And so if the speaker or writer does not have a strong understanding of his or her audience, the success of the message is going to be largely compromised. Now, Why is this important? Why do we care about the rhetorical triangle, or how can we use it to help us write a rhetorical analysis? So the rhetorical triangle is really critical because it helps us as a writer understand who the audience is. And so our goal with rhetorical analysis is to determine why and how does a writer or speaker use rhetoric to persuade an audience. And so obviously, by understanding the specific rhetorical situation of a given text, whether that is an essay, a speech, a video, a movie, we as the writers can anticipate what the audience wants, what they care about, what they value, and then we can use that information to help us understand what a speaker or writer will use in terms of rhetoric and persuasive strategies to target the audience. So if we are reading a speech, we can anticipate, we can predict using the rhetorical triangle what strategies the writer speaker will use to convince the audience, and that will make our job, which is analyzing the speech, analyzing the text, much easier. So again, it's critical to understand the rhetorical triangle and its usefulness in helping us analyze texts so that we can fully understand why and how a writer or speaker uses rhetoric to persuade audiences. That is the main goal of a rhetorical analysis. And so the rhetorical strategy is a powerful tool that can be employed to help with that analysis. So again, to recap quickly, we have a triangle structure, triangle diagram or representation of communication. We always have a speaker or writer communicating to an audience. There's always a subject being communicated, obviously, as well as a medium. And what we are trying to understand is the persuasive strategies that is being used to communicate to the audience. And the audience, again, informs why and how the speaker or writer is using certain persuasive strategies over others to convey a message. So I hope that this video clarified what the rhetorical triangle is, as well as gave more details about what rhetoric is and how all of these elements come to play in a rhetorical analysis. In future videos in this series, we'll be discussing more specific rhetorical strategies that a writer or speaker may use depending on text and depending on the needs of the audience. So I hope to see you then.